Chapter 6 Lions and Dragons.
Though he thought himself forsaken, having lost his love, land, and title, Yvain's act of saving the lion from the terrible, murderous, bloodthirsty dragon became his first step towards redemption.
Jack rubbed his head under his mane, checking for any new lumps forming at the spots where Tooth had hit him with her wooden sword. "Saved is a bit generous," he muttered to Sandy. Sandy gave him a sympathetic pat before running back behind the curtain, carrying the string they used as the lion's tail in his dragon sock puppet's mouth. Tooth glanced at him over her shoulder, smiling apologetically before continuing her monologue. Jack rolled his eyes, checking the position of the sun again. They were about midway through their performance of The Tale of Sir Yvain, the Knight of the Lion, and had been midway for the last however long it took for Tooth's Yvain to finally slay the dragon and cut off the lion's tail from its jaws. Given Jack and Sandy's height difference, the lion ended up getting the worst of her attempts. It didn't help Jack's boredom that they had voted 3-1 against him to cut the special effects for the scenes where Yvain visited the magic fountain to awaken the thunder and lightning storms. But, to be fair, the last 5 times he offered to help Sandy with the special effects, he had gotten a bit too eager, and may or may not have completely doused Tooth and Bunny and the entire audience and flooded their set. Jack would just have to grin and bear it. At least he had something to look forward to after the show. Tooth swung her arm around Jack's shoulders, forcing Jack to lean down for her to reach.
"From that day forward, Sir Yvain and his lion became the best of friends," she announced with a huge smile.
Jack half-heartedly raised his fist. "Yippee!" The crowd collectively awed. Tooth gestured to the wings.
"They worked as a team to defeat many mighty foes, much stronger than either of them alone."
Sandy pushed out wooden cutouts of various monsters from the story. Their stands made a loud grating sound as they slid across the stage floor. They still hadn't gotten around to replacing the wheels Jack had ruined. After a beat, Tooth nudged Jack forward. Jack huffed in annoyance, walking over to them. He stuck his arm out straight in front of him, deadpanning at Tooth. Tooth held her hands out, presenting him to the crowd.
"Together they defeated a mighty giant," smack. "2 horrible demons," smack, smack. "And when he was met with Yvain's comrades, the lion lay upon the ground in front of them and licked their feet like a trained dog."
"Yeah, you guys are gonna have to use your imagination for that."
"Jack, come on."
"Lickety-lick, hope you like my spit."
"Okay, moving on,"
Tooth sighed.
"One day, as they were journeying through the enchanted forest, they once again came across a familiar tower and heard a familiar voice. 'Help me, Sir Knight!'
cried Bunny. "Or," Jack cut in, "we just keep walking. Come on." Tooth caught Jack's arm before he could leave.
"Lunette, is that thy voice I hear?"
she called. Bunny sat cross-legged on a stool atop a stack of sticks, leaning his chin on one hand. None of the dresses they had had fit him, so they settled on him wearing the bottom half of one as a skirt. The wig he was wearing drooped into his face, but it wasn't enough to hide the smug grin he was giving Jack. Maybe if Jack tried hard enough, he could light the sticks on fire with his mind.
"Oh, how grateful I am to see thee, mysterious Knight of the Lion,"
Bunny lamented.
"for I have been falsely accused of treason against my lady Laudine, Sir Yvain's estranged wife. I beg of thee to defend my honor and save me from burning at the pyre. As the Knight of the Lion, I can save my old friend Lunette. That way I might earn her forgiveness and be one step closer to regaining my honor as Sir Yvain and redeeming myself in Laudine's eyes,"
Tooth theatrically whispered to the audience.
"Fear not, Lunette," Tooth declared, "for I and my best friend, the lion, will surely free thee."
Jack narrowed his eyes. "I don't know. I feel like we should just leave her."
"Jack,"
Tooth whispered, elbowing him. Bunny smiled wider.
"Sir Knight, it seems thy lion has not been fully trained. Perhaps he should be made to sit and roll over for treats."
"For one so flammable, that's bold of you to say, Lunette," Jack threatened.
"Yeah? What art thou going to do about it, lion?"
"I've magically grown opposable thumbs and magically picked up a lit torch on our way here."
"Don't mind him, Lunette,"
Tooth cut in, laughing awkwardly.
"For my lion just loves to jest. So much."
"I don't know, Yvain," Jack said. "Is Laudine really worth all this questing? I feel like one person's putting way more work into this relationship than the other." Tooth pulled Jack's mane over his head to cut him off.
Where are thine accusers?
Tooth asked Bunny. On cue, Sandy popped out from the wings, pushing 3 wooden cutouts of knights across the stage. They skidded to a halt, and Sandy ducked behind them, juggling their 3 wooden swords in preparation for the fight. Tooth turned away from the audience so that they couldn't see her speak.
"Here we are," she yelled in a gruffer voice. "But we are 3 and thou art 1. We suggest that thou leave at once."
Sandy awkwardly raised his 3 swords in emphasis. Tooth turned around as Yvain again, alternating between her now 4 on-stage roles.
Only those who are afraid run away. I am not. Take back thy lies about this girl.
She persuaded a lady to marry a worthless man, that Yvain.
I, the Knight of the Lion, who is definitely not also Sir Yvain, will fight all 3 of ye to defend her innocence.
Very well, but keep that wild beast away.
Tooth, as Yvain, turned to Jack.
Stay back, Lion, for this battle is all my fault.
Hey, go for it,
Jack said, holding his hands up and stepping back. Tooth whirled around and battle-cried, scooting a few steps forward so that she was in front of Sandy. The 2 of them lightly tapped their wooden swords together a few times before Tooth tripped. Sandy dropped all 3 swords on top of her, and Tooth cried out.
This may be the end of the Knight of the Lion, she lamented.
There was a pause.
This may be the end of the Knight of the Lion.
Another pause.
Jack!
Jack sighed. He walked up to the 3 puppets, sticking his arms straight out and mechanically knocking one flat on the floor. Roar or whatever.
Lion,
Tooth cried.
I told thee not to interfere.
I'm getting mixed signals here, Yvain. No wonder Laudine broke up with... Oh, hey, what the... Sandy had picked up the other 2 swords and was whacking him as the other 2 knights, only being tall enough to reach his stomach and legs. His smile told Jack that it was a little more personal than just for the play. Jack fell to the ground and curled up into a ball, covering his head with one arm while blocking Sandy's swords with the other. He saw Bunny put his face in his hands, desperately trying to mask his cackling as theatrical sobs.
"Ow, Sandy,"
Jack whispered.
"Quit it, I'm already down."
Sandy gave him one last whack for good measure. Tooth gasped, rising to her feet. She put a hand on her hip and brandished her sword high in the air.
"I'm seeing my best friend harmed. My strength and rage have returned twicefold."
Tooth charged the last 2 puppets, doing a graceful flip over them before striking them down with 2 hard blows. The crowd roared in applause. Tooth bowed, holding a hand out to Bunny.
"Thou art safe now, Lunette." "Thank thee, my champion, O Knight of the Lion. I am forever in thy debt,"
Bunny replied, swooning. Tooth turned back to Jack.
"Lion, art thou okay, my dear friend?"
"Nope, I'm dead."
"Oh, surely not. Rise, Lion, for we have much adventuring ahead."
"Sorry, can't hear you. I'm in lion heaven." "Try hitting him again to wake him up," Bunny called.
That won't be necessary,"
Jack said, pointing at Sandy before he could take another swing. "No use beating a dead lion."
"Please, Lion," Tooth pleaded. "We still need to reunite with King Arthur and Sir Gawain and go back to the fountain to awaken another storm."
Yeah, what a shame." Jack rolled onto his side, crossing his arms. Tooth sighed.
"Well, we got further than the last time,"
she conceded. She turned to address the audience again.
"And thus Lunette was saved. We'll have to tell the other half of the story tomorrow, but know that Sir Yvain redeemed himself in the end, all because of his bond with the lion. In one chance encounter, one act of kindness, and in empathy for another, Yvain and the lion went to save the lives of many and remained lifelong friends to the day they left this world."
The audience applauded one last time and slowly left the square. A few of the kids waved goodbye to Jack as they walked away. Jack grinned over his shoulder and waved back. After the last of them disappeared in the street, he rolled up to stand, tossing his mane off over to the pile of props. He jumped to the ground, waving to the others. "I'll see you guys back at the inn." "Where do you think you're going?" Bunny called after him. "We still have to take down the set." Jack turned, still walking backwards. "I gotta meet Hiccup for the project. It's getting close to the time we agreed on." Bunny gave him a lopsided smile. He tossed Jack his feathered hat. "Don't forget this." Jack caught it out of the air. He glared at it for a beat before relenting, flipping it onto his head. He grabbed the loot off the prop pile, smiling back at Bunny before he ran off into the city. Though his shows with the bards were always chaotic at best, the upside to the job was always being able to bring joy to the children in any town they came across. Jack had anticipated Hiccup being late to their meeting point, probably having to take some extra time dodging guards on his way, so he decided he might as well entertain some kids while he waited. Sure enough, by the time he spotted Hiccup in the alleyway, he had already amassed a small audience and was leading them around in the square. It took him another song or two for the kids to finally let him go. Jack was still smiling after the last few of them waved goodbye. Hiccup was watching him with an amused look. He smirked at Jack as he jogged up to him.
"You're terrible at playing that."
Jack sniffed. "I don't know what you're talking about. I sound great." To demonstrate, Jack held up the lute and dragged his fingers across the strings, a grating, out-of-tune chord springing out of them. Hiccup winced. He shushed him and pulled Jack further into the alley.
Okay, you've made your point,"
Hiccup whispered, rolling his eyes when Jack snickered. He looked up and down Jack's bard uniform, settling on his hat. Hiccup smirked.
"I like the hat. It suits you."
Jack raised a brow, taking in Hiccup's new outfit. "I wouldn't be so quick to judge other people's clothes. What happened to you?" Hiccup had a helmet under one arm and was wearing a thick blue tunic with leather arm bracers, shoulder pads, and belt. The strangest part was that the entire uniform was covered in dried mud. There was a coat of arms embroidered on the chest, and Jack could barely make out the image of a sword and battle axe through the grime. Hiccup scratched his cheek, looking down at his tunic.
"I needed another disguise."
"The mud is a nice touch."
"Thank you. I rolled in it myself."
Jack guffawed, slapping a hand over his mouth to stifle his laughter when Hiccup shushed him again. "You didn't have another cloak?" Jack choked out between snorts.
"I lost it in a sword fight."
Hiccup waved before Jack could ask.
"Doesn't matter. Did you bring your friend's shirt?"
Jack grinned, pulling Bunny's white shirt and Hiccup's cloak out of his bag. He handed them to Hiccup and turned to let him change. The shirt was the right length, but it hung loose off of Hiccup's frame, nearly swallowing him whole. Jack pulled out one of Bunny's green sashes that he brought just in case, and Hiccup tied it around his waist, trying and failing to keep the collar from drooping to one side, his collarbone sticking out. There wasn't much he could do about the sleeves, and he rolled them up to his elbows, the cloth baggy around his arms. Hiccup fastened his cloak over his shoulders, packing his squire uniform into the bag Jack had brought.
"You sure he's not going to notice these are missing?"
he asked Jack. "Actually, he gave them to me."
"Why did he do that?"
"I kinda told him about you and what we're doing."
"What?"
Jack shushed him this time. "Don't worry. The other bards are all in on it. They'll help cover for us." Hiccup groaned, putting his face in his hand.
"I'm already regretting this,"
he muttered. Jack snickered again. "Too late now. You're stuck with me." Hiccup glared at him.
"I am, aren't I?"
Jack beamed, taking off his hat and giving Hiccup a flamboyant bow. "After you, my good, normal civilian Hiccup." Hiccup smiled, pulling his hood over his head. Jack put his hat back on and followed him out the alley. Hiccup led them towards the outskirts of the city, away from the busy merchant and residential areas. After climbing over one last hill, they arrived at a massive forge. If Jack didn't know any better, and the sides of the building weren't open save for the support pillars, he would have thought it was a small fortress. Next to the furnace in the center stood a giant Burkian man hammering away at a glowing hot piece of metal. It took Jack a minute to realize that he wasn't holding the hammer. His left hand was the hammer, attached to the man's arm as a prosthetic. He also had a prosthetic right leg. He'd seen a lot of missing limbs and prosthetics walking around Berg, some that were crafted for a specific task or occupation. He assumed that it was just a part of the warrior culture here.
"Gobber!"
Hiccup called as they entered the forge. Gobber looked up.
"Hiccup! It's good to see you, lad."
Gobber tossed his metal thing into a giant bucket of water, and a massive plume of steam shot up behind him. He paid it no mind as he walked over. He gave Hiccup a solid pat on the back that almost sent Hiccup stumbling to the ground. "What's this new shirt you're wearing? Hoping you'll grow into it."
"What, you don't think it shows off my intimidating stature?"
Gobber gave a loud cackle, patting him again. "I don't think clothes are going to help you there." Jack watched their exchange, paying close attention to Hiccup. Granted, this was only the third time that he'd seen him in person, but he looked incredibly comfortable in this environment. The caution in his movements melted away, and he carried himself with a new confidence, as if he wasn't concerned with how others perceived him. After they finished their banter, Gobber glanced at Jack. "And who's this? Did you bring me an extra toothpick as a present?" Jack grinned. "Too late for that. I've still got some meat stuck on me from the last guy and grew a mouth and eyes."
"Didn't have enough left over for a brain, apparently,"
Hiccup quipped. Jack showed him an unimpressed look. "Jack Frost," he said to Gobber, holding out a hand. "But you can call me Jack." Gobber took his hand, his own hand swallowing Jack's, and part of his forearm as well. Jack tried not to stumble as Gobber gave him a firm shake. Hiccup gestured to Jack.
"Gobber, Jack's the one who helped me get the bolts and screws yesterday."
"That was you? Good on you, lads. You boys made quite the splash. You best keep your head low till this blows over, though. Give the guards some time to forget your face." "Aw, if I'm that easy to forget, then I need to pull a bigger stunt next time." Gobber cackled at that. Hiccup rolled his eyes, putting on a work apron and gloves. It was covered in stains from past projects, and there were smudges of charcoal writing on it, as if Hiccup couldn't find paper and had settled for jotting down notes on his clothes. Hiccup nodded to him to follow, leading Jack around to the back of the forge, where a large triangular mass lay covered by a cloth. Hiccup pulled the cloth away with both hands, unveiling the glider. Jack's eyes lit up. "Wow!" Hiccup grinned at him. The glider looked like something out of the storybooks. Measuring in jacks, the main body was a little more than 2 jacks long, adding another jack for the length of the tail. Its wingspan was twice the width. The wings themselves were constructed of a mix of wood and metal ribbing, spanning in long semicircle shapes that attached to the body. A smooth white cloth was drawn across the structure, with wooden spars and wires holding it taut. Most of the main body was made of wood, most likely to keep it as light as possible. However, Jack noted a long metal wire that connected the foot pedals to the back tail fins, the left of which was currently lying half-constructed next to the main body. Immediately after his initial awe, Jack bombarded Hiccup with questions, like how did it support itself in the air, and how did you steer it, or how high and far he thought he could fly with it, and what the foot pedals were, and how they connected with the tail mechanics. Hiccup seemed more than happy to answer, getting more animated the more they spoke. He also told Jack a bunch of sketches, walking him through some of his earlier concepts. Jack was impressed by his drawing skills, grinning every time he found a small doodle in the margins. After circling around the glider a few times, Jack crawled under it to where the handles were going to go, lying on his back underneath the wings. The warm sunlight was evenly diffused across the cloth, not an open seam to be seen. Jack ran his fingers across the even stitchwork. Hiccup's attention to detail was flawless. Hiccup joined him on the other side, lying on his back as well. He smiled when he saw what Jack was doing. He raised his own hand to meet where Jack's was, pointing out changes he made to the underwiring as well. As Hiccup explained the structure of the ribbing, Jack was beginning to notice a familiar design. He had seen them all over Berg, after all. "They're kind of like dragon wings." Hiccup smiled.
"That was the idea."
Jack smiled back. "We could have used something like this for our show today. It was the tale of Sir Yvain, the Knight and the Lion."
"Yeah? Who did you play?"
There was a beat. "The lion." Hiccup gave a loud snort, covering his mouth.
"Were you crawling on all fours?"
"Absolutely not."
"What? Didn't it ruin the authentic theater experience?"
"It was already ruined by me making the lion talk the whole show."
"Sounds like you talking is a recurring problem in general,"
Hiccup chuckled. Jack elbowed him, but it only made Hiccup chuckle more. His shoulders shook in the effort to stifle his laughter.
"Did any part of you actually resemble a lion?"
"Unfortunately, I lost the face paint for the whiskers and nose," Jack smirked. "But we managed to pull together a last-minute mane by cutting a hole in a wig."
"What happened to the real mane?"
"I dunked it in more jam, but apparently the fake blood was too scary for the children."
"Yeah, that tracks,"
Hiccup snickered.
"Dare I even ask what the dragon looked like?"
"It was Sandy's sock puppet that he gripped my arm with while Tooth chased us around the stage with a stick." That finally cracked Hiccup's composure. He turned onto his back and let out a loud laugh. His smile was so wide that it pushed up his cheeks and stretched his freckles, and his brows didn't furrow for once, even as he squeezed his eyes shut. That was the first time Jack had seen him so at ease. Joy suited him. Jack felt himself grin too, even if the joke was at his expense. Anyway, point is, Yvain befriended it by saving it from a bloodthirsty dragon, and we could have used a better prop. Hiccup got the last giggles out of his system. He took on a pensive look.
"Some variations of the story say it was a serpent instead of a dragon."
"You're familiar with them?"
"Of course. I've read every copy of them that we have in the castle library. They're the history of this land, and we can learn a lot by studying them closely."
Jack scrunched up his nose. "Ugh, when you put it that way."
To be fair, most people here share that sentiment. The books were pretty dusty.
Hiccup chuckled. He paused for a beat.
Maybe there wasn't even a monster at all. Sir Yvain and the Lion has always been my favorite story, but I like to believe in the ones where it's not a dragon that Yvain had to slay.
That was odd, considering Hiccup's lineage. From everything that Jack had seen up until this point, killing dragons was one of the greatest sources of pride for Burke. Jack turned back to the glider. So, what made you decide to build this? To Jack's surprise, the cheer drained out of Hiccup all at once. He traced the ribbing on the wings with his fingertips.
To help a friend. I need to get him home, and traveling by air is the fastest and only way to do it.
Where's home for your friend?
The other side of the murderous mountains.
Jack's eyes widened. All the way up the mountains? What kind of person is he to live there?
He's like no one I've ever met before. He, likes to keep to himself, though. Doesn't trust others easily. I mean, the first time we met, he almost bit my head off. Figuratively speaking, of course. It took a few more encounters before he finally stopped trying to kill me.
Well, he sounds fun.
He is, believe it or not, once you earn his trust.
Hiccup chuckled. He paused.
I'm the only one he's accepting help from.
He sounded oddly guilty when he said that. Jack shifted so he could face him. Why is that? Hiccup stared at him with a familiar expression. After a moment, Jack recognized it. It was what he must have looked like when he spoke with Bunny by the carriage all those years ago. Whatever Hiccup saw in him, it made him decide to risk it, just like Jack had back then. Hiccup took a deep breath.
Because it's my fault that he's trapped here in the first place.
Jack's brows rose. Trapped? Hiccup nodded.
For the past several months, Burke's been under attack from unknown forces coming from the same mountains, and I think they're connected somehow. Whoever they are, I think they're looking for him. If I can get him home before they reach the villages, then we might be able to avoid an all-out war.
Does anyone else know about him? Hiccup shook his head.
There's already been bloodshed on both sides, and we can't seem to find a way to communicate with the outsiders. If any of our soldiers find him before I can finish a working prototype...
A lot of things weren't adding up for Jack. If the invaders were looking for Hiccup's friend, then wouldn't it be easiest to send an escort with him to meet the other side peacefully? Why did he need to hide? Had his friend already killed people in Burke? And if that was the case, why would Hiccup be helping him in the first place? Hiccup wasn't meeting his gaze. His brows were furrowed deep over his eyes, and his jaw was set in determination. Jack recognized that look, too. He made a decision. Then we'll have to get this thing off the ground as soon as possible. Hiccup's eyes snapped back to him.
We?
What? You didn't think I was leaving you alone after this, did you? I want to be here when it happens. Plus, I can pick up whatever supplies you need from the market and save you the trouble of crawling around the alleys. Jack closed his eyes and gave a mock sniff in disgust. Like a peasant. Hiccup rolled his eyes and elbowed Jack.
Won't people find it strange that a bard is buying boatloads of material?
Well, it won't be boatloads. I mean, look at me. Jack held out his arms. How much do you think I can carry? Hiccup chuckled at that. He shifted to face Jack, too.
Why aren't you still helping me? I thought we were square now.
Jack grinned. Like I said before, it looks like fun. And I want to help your friend, too. Hiccup was still hesitating, but past the caution, Jack saw a new light in his eyes. A spark of hope, small but bright.
You don't even know who he is.
No, but I know what you're feeling, Jack said softer. Carrying a secret to protect someone else. He sounds like someone important to you. That's all I need to know. Hiccup's face split into the same wide grin from before, but now it was directed at Jack. Jack was taken aback by the vulnerability in his eyes, and even more than that, sheer relief. Jack noted how toothy his smile was when he was grinning this wide. It was endearing. Jack decided to make it his goal to get him to smile like that more. He gave him a smile back, then ran his fingers over the wings again. If this thing's meant to glide on wind, doesn't that mean it'll fall back to the ground eventually? How are you planning on getting it to go up the mountains? To Jack's surprise, Hiccup smirked.
Oh, I'm not worried about that. This is a preliminary step. For now, I just have to worry about the wing and tail mechanics so it can stay in the air.
All right, sounds like a plan. Jack held a finger up. I do have one condition, though. Hiccup raised a brow, a playful gleam in his eyes.
Yeah? What is it?
Jack grinned. When it's done, we test fly it together. Hiccup grinned back.
Deal.
So what made you start working at the forge in the first place? Jack asked as they made their way back into the city. Hiccup fidgeted with his helmet as they walked, passing it back and forth in his hands.
Well, as a kid I wasn't much good at fighting, among all the other royal training. So at one point my dad sent me to the blacksmith to see if it was a weapons issue.
Was it?
No, turns out I was just left-handed. Sword fighting's about the only thing my dad's happy with me doing. But while I was at the forge, I got curious about what else I could make. It felt good to create things, other than messes, I mean. And fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, I stayed small enough to be able to fit through the secret passages in the castle, so I've been going there ever since.
Secret passages, you say? Hiccup deadpanned at him. Jack held his crooked smile for a beat longer before breaking character and snickering. Hiccup rolled his eyes, but he smiled too. After their conversation under the glider, he was much more at ease around Jack. Jack hopped onto a stone curb lining the road, balancing on it as they walked. How did you manage to win Gobber over?
Gobber took a liking to me after I visited a few more times alone. Guess he saw something in me that made him want to mentor me.
He seems like quite the character. Hiccup chuckled.
I think he just likes having someone around to make fun of, and who has no choice but to endure his singing.
Then you're about to get that twicefold. Jack held up his lute, one hand hovering over the strings.
That's just perfect. By the way, did I mention I can't guarantee that you won't die in a freak flying accident?
Jack adjusted the strap on his lute so it hung off his back, holding his hands up in surrender. He grinned when Hiccup laughed. Does anyone else know about the forge?
Just Gobber and one other.
Hiccup was cut off when a dagger shot through the air and buried itself less than a foot from where they were. Jack yelped and nearly fell off the curb, just managing to land on his feet. He saw Hiccup stare at it in recognition, his face going pale. Jack heard a horse whinny and looked up at the sound. His jaw dropped open. Up on the hill was a lone knight riding on a beautiful mare. She was in a full suit of armor, the metal gleaming a silvery blue, a blue sash tied around her waist with her belt. The visor on the helmet was pulled down, leaving only a long braid of blonde hair hanging out the back. On the front of her breastplate, etched in gold, was the same coat of arms that had been on Hiccup's tunic. She was the first knight that Jack had ever seen in real life. And she might be the last. The knight spurred her horse forward, barreling down the path straight at Jack. Jack stumbled back in surprise. Hiccup jumped in between them and Jack before he was trampled.
Astrid, wait! He's a friend!
Oh, we're friends? Hiccup shot Jack a look before turning back to the knight.
He's not a threat.
I know, said the knight. She flipped up the visor on her helmet, revealing a heart-shaped face with a strong jawline, her fair skin lightly tanned from long days in the sun. She had a smaller braid wrapping the front of her head and a fringe framing her face. A few strands fell neatly over her blue eyes, that were currently leveling a glare down at them both. I was making a point. Astrid dismounted her horse. Easy, Stormfly, she said. She stroked its neck a few times before walking up to them. She kicked up her dagger on the way, popping it out of the ground and into her hand without breaking her stride. She twirled it and sheathed it back in her belt. Where were you last night? She asked Hiccup.
Sorry, I lost track of time,
Hiccup replied with a wince. He gestured to Jack at the same time as giving him a meaningful look.
Jack, this is Astrid. She's the second person aside from Gobber who knows about the forge.
But not about his friend.
Astrid, this is Jack,
Hiccup introduced him.
He offered to help out with the project.
Jack held out his hand. Good to meet you, Astrid. Astrid didn't move to take it. She blinked a few times at him. You told a bard? She asked Hiccup. All that effort hiding your secret, and you just spilled to a random bard you meet in the street? Jack flashed her his signature grin. I'm a special bard. Astrid scowled. Hiccup waved to distract her attention, shooting Jack a glare.
Well, not just any bard,
Hiccup chuckled nervously.
He helped me dodge the guards the other day.
Astrid's eyebrows shot up.
They were bards?
Special bards, Jack emphasized.
Jack, wait, they?
Hiccup asked Astrid.
You knew about Tooth, too?
Astrid deadpanned.
Hiccup, I read the guard's report.
Hiccup groaned and face-palmed. Jack snickered at him, which caught Astrid's attention again. "Did you have something to do with last night?" Jack snorted. "If only. The others wouldn't let me come see him until after the show this morning."
"His entire troupe knows?"
Jack winced. Hiccup's shoulders were hunched so high it looked like he was trying to bury his head into his body. Astrid narrowed her eyes at Jack. She drew her sword and pointed it at his throat. As if he was in tune with her, Hiccup stepped in between them simultaneously, pushing Jack back with his arm.
"Astrid, why are you helping him?" Astrid demanded. "What do you hope to gain out of this?"
"A free trip to the castle would be nice." Jack smirked.
"Jack!"
Hiccup frantically turned back and forth, sending Astrid pleading looks and shooting Jack glares. Astrid raised her sword to point right in between Jack's eyes.
"That can be arranged. I'll personally escort you and your friends to the dungeon."
"No, don't." Jack's smile fell immediately. He pushed Hiccup's arm aside and held out his hand to her. "Please, the others aren't a threat to you. I'm the one who wanted to get involved. If you're going to arrest anyone, arrest me." Astrid searched his expression for a long moment. Whatever she saw made her lower her sword. Hiccup let out a breath, lowering his arms too.
"He's telling the truth. I stayed out late and ended up crashing outside."
Astrid furrowed her brows.
"Where? Gobber said you weren't at the forge either."
Hiccup grimaced, and Jack could see him scrambling for an excuse. He was starting to connect the dots. If you didn't go back to the castle or the forge last night...
"I found him lying in the dirt under some trees nearby,"
Jack filled in. In the brief moment that Astrid looked away, Jack saw Hiccup's eyes widen at him. Jack smirked. "You must have been really tired to have slept through rolling around in all that mud." Hiccup grinned back, warm with gratitude. "Mud?" Astrid looked at Hiccup's outfit, finally noticing the change.
"Where's the squire uniform I gave you?"
Hiccup's panic returned in full, and Jack cackled. Astrid scowled at them in confusion. Hiccup laughed nervously and pulled the uniform out of his bag to show her. Her mouth fell open.
"Hiccup!"
I know, I'm sorry. I'll take it to the wash house myself."
Astrid sheathed her sword and yanked the uniform out of his hands, turning it back and forth to examine it.
"This was the last one I had. You can't even see the coat of arms."
"You have a squire?" Jack asked.
"She has 4,
Hiccup answered. Jack raised a brow. "Impressive." Hiccup chuckled.
"That's not exactly the word I would use to describe them."
Astrid scowled and punched Hiccup's arm.
4 temporary parasites. Then never again, after they're not my problem anymore."
Hiccup winced.
"You could at least punch the other arm,"
he groused.
"The bruises on that one have bruises."
"You can punch me back if you want."
"You're in a full suit of armor."
Jack smiled to himself as he watched the two of them. He could tell they had been friends for a long time from the way they were grinning at each other between the banter. There was clearly a deep trust between them, judging by how protective Astrid was of Hiccup. Jack didn't doubt that Hiccup was the same way with her. So despite Jack's promise to him, he couldn't help but wonder, what kind of person was this mysterious friend of Hiccup's for him to keep him a secret from her, too? After Astrid got a few more jabs at Hiccup, she turned to address Jack again. There was still skepticism in her expression, but at least she didn't look 3 seconds away from murdering him anymore. Astrid gave him a nod.
"Sorry for threatening to arrest and kill you."
Jack raised a brow, a wide grin curling onto his lips. "It wouldn't be the first time that that's happened to me." Astrid narrowed her eyes back, Hiccup deadpan next to her. Jack chuckled, and decided he'd spare Hiccup the headache. He dropped the grin, giving Astrid a real smile instead. "It's all right, don't worry." Jack offered his hand.
"Jack Frost, it's good to meet another one of Hiccup's friends."
Astrid didn't drop her guard, but she did take his hand, giving it a firm shake. A very firm shake.
"Astrid Hofferson. Likewise."
Hiccup breathed a sigh of relief. Astrid bumped his arm.
"Come on, the king's waiting for you."
Astrid mounted Stormfly again, helping Hiccup up to sit behind her. Jack stepped out of their way. "Let me know if you need a 5th squire," Jack joked. That finally earned him a smirk from Astrid.
"Don't give me another reason to want to murder you."
Jack sucked in a breath through his teeth. "That bad, huh?" Hiccup pressed his lips into a thin line and nodded, while Astrid glared at the sky accusingly. Jack gave a loud laugh at that. Hiccup smiled gratefully.
"I'll see you tomorrow, Jack."
Jack smiled back. "Looking forward to it." With that, Astrid spurred Stormfly forward, heading back towards the city. Hiccup waved goodbye to Jack over his shoulder. Jack waved back until they disappeared from sight. The knights are after you now." "Is that the only part you heard?" Jack asked. "It's the most prudent part." Bunny groaned, pacing in circles around the room at the inn, pulling at his hair. "This was a mistake. We should have left when it was just the guards, but we already put the deposit down with the inn, but maybe we can nick it back if— Sandy, I swear!" Sandy, who had been stroking Bunny's head soothingly, held his hands up in surrender. He was sitting on top of a stack of their travel bags, keeping Bunny from packing their stuff again. "They're not technically after me. It's just Astrid, and she's covering for Hiccup too. She's on our side," Jack said with a shrug. "So what's the problem?" "She threw a dagger at you and threatened you at sword point." "Well, you guys pickpocketed me when we first met, and look at us now. One of these things is significantly worse than the other."
"I agree with Jack,"
Tooth chimed in. She stood up on one of the beds and addressed them like an audience.
"Astrid sounds like a great ally to have. Worst comes to worst, we're all spry enough to slip away from some regular old knights, even at your age, Bunny."
Bunny leveled her with a glare, which Tooth promptly ignored. Sandy put his hands on Bunny's shoulder. He gestured to Jack, then held one hand up while drawing a cross over his heart with the other. Lastly, he shrugged his shoulders while taking a quick breath. A hiccup, Jack realized. "I don't think he's going to appreciate that," Jack snickered. Sandy smiled wide, his shoulders shaking in laughter as well.
"But Sandy's right," said Tooth. "He's already given Hiccup his promise. From the sounds of it, Hiccup needs all the help he can get."
She leaned towards the others and covered her mouth.
"Plus, this is the first new friend he's made in 3 years. It'll be healthy for him. We've talked about this."
Jack did a double take. "You what?" "It's usually when you're too busy sulking to notice," Bunny smirked. Tooth and Sandy both gave him guilty shrugs. Jack's cheeks burned so hot that he had to physically restrain himself from slapping his hands over them. He coughed a few times, hoping to hide it.
"So, does that mean it's still a yes?"
Sandy gave him a serene smile and nodded, while Bunny heaved a sigh. "I already gave you my word. I'm in." Tooth grinned, turning to Jack again.
"Thank you."
Jack gave her a confused smile back.
"For what?"
Her eyes softened.
"For letting us help you."
Jack faltered. The others were looking at him in a way that could only be described as caring. There was a pang in his heart. At the same time, there was a sinking feeling pulling inside of him. He decided to ignore that part. Jack swallowed a few times so that his voice wasn't hoarse.
"Thanks, guys."
Hiccup was dragging his feet through the hallway, after dragging his feet to change back into his normal royal tunic and cloak, after dragging his feet to wash off the last of the mud from his face and hair. This part of the castle was relatively empty this afternoon, save for the odd guard or servant. Whenever someone passed him, they made sure to bow to him, which Hiccup would have to awkwardly wave away every time. It was a long walk leading to the Great Hall, and the hallway was lined with huge portraits of the kings and queens of Berg's past. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, illuminating the colors in the paintings and highlighting their intimidating stature. Hiccup tried not to look at them as he passed by. All too soon, he reached the massive doors at the end. He took a deep breath, adjusting his crown. Then he grasped the large handles and pushed them open. As much as he was dreading this meeting, he was relieved to get out of the hallway of paintings and into the giant room filled with tapestries of dragons lining the high walls between the windows. After admiring them for a moment, he took in the rest of the room. In the spirit of fairness in Berg, every citizen was expected to be trained in basic combat. Everyone in the castle pitched in to chores and errands, no matter their status, and each person had a seat in the hall. These days, everyone was spread so thin that even the chefs didn't have time to prepare the meals until the last minute. That seemed to be the case today as well, seeing as the tens of long tables and benches were completely empty. In fact, the entire room was empty of people, save for one person. Stoic was there at the opposite end, pacing around the fireplace that was even taller than him. He looked up at the heavy groan of the doors. "Oh, son, there you are." Hiccup hunched up his shoulders, stretching his mouth into a grin.
"Here I am."
There was a beat of silence. "So," Stoic said, clapping his hands. The sound echoed throughout the empty hall. "How are things with,
Sword fighting?"
Hiccup offered.
"Sword fighting, yes.
How's that been going?"
"Oh, the usual."
Hiccup did a thumbs up and swung his arm in front of him.
"Astrid's still winning, but I'm losing less, so it's, we're getting there."
"Yes, getting there.
Yeah.
Good. Stoic huffed, rubbing his hands together. Hiccup rocked back and forth on his feet, looking around the room. The silence dragged on. Finally, Stoic cleared his throat. And what about the whole creating psychic bonds with sheep to cure sleeplessness business? Hiccup cringed internally. Astrid really didn't pull her punches.
Oh, great. Yeah, saves a lot of time not having to count them.
Loved it enough to stay out all night, did you? Weren't even tired after that run across the rooftops. Hiccup sighed.
Dad, I can't explain.
Stoic held up a hand and shook his head in resignation. That's what I wanted to talk with you about. Stoic let out a long sigh. Son, with the state of things in Berg, I need to know where you are at all times. Hiccup took a quick breath.
Is it because of the closing borders?
Stoic's brows furrowed deep over his eyes. Hiccup, he warned.
Dad, just hear me out. Are you on about the peace talks again? The outsiders don't have a center of communication, right? They're just coming in one big wave. But I've been thinking...
Son, we've been over this.
What if you could create one point of contact to meet them at their center? It's a risk, but I have another plan that I'm close to...
That's enough! Hiccup faltered, his hands frozen in the air from where they had been gesturing. Hiccup, we are on the brink of war. I don't have time to entertain your... Stoic held his hands out, grasping at some invisible thing in the air as he struggled for the words. In the end, he threw his arms wide and gestured to the whole room. Ideas, he settled on. I need to focus on protecting this kingdom and its people. It was Hiccup's turn to get angry. He took a step forward.
Which I am trying to help with, if you would just stop being stubborn long enough to lose...
But I can't do that if I'm worrying about God knows where you run off to next, Stoic bellowed, his voice drowning out Hiccup's. The two of them lapsed back into silence, with only the sound of their breathing to fill it, as they both tried to calm down. Stoic heaved a long sigh, turning away. So, for the sake of my own sanity, I need you to stay where I can see you, or stay put. Deal?
But, Dad,
Deal? Hiccup took a deep breath through gritted teeth. He clenched and unclenched his fists a few times, feeling the fight drain out of him. He let the breath out, hanging his head and scowling at the ground.
Deal.
Hiccup had gone straight to his drafting desk in the tower after meeting with his dad. His mood had taken a drastic turn from where it had been after spending all night with Toothless, then the afternoon with Jack, and he desperately needed something to do with his hands as a distraction. He tried sketching out some plans for other inventions, but his thoughts were too heavy to be able to focus enough for those. His desk was situated right in front of the large window in the room, with a perfect view of the mountains and the dragon flags against them. Usually when he was in one of these moods, he'd use the view as inspiration to draw them. Any and all species that he had read about in books, or that would come from his imagination. Today, however, instead of inventions or dragons, Hiccup found himself drawing a portrait. The door creaked open.
Checking if I'm still here?
Checking on my friend, Astrid replied. Hiccup gave her a smile.
Your friend is doing remarkably well after creating psychic bonds with sheep.
I warned you I'd get creative, Astrid shrugged. I had your whole plan for the process laid out in case he asked. It mostly involved eating a lot of grass.
That's incredibly thorough of you.
Well, you gave me a full day to come up with it. Hiccup grimaced.
Sorry, won't happen again.
Astrid gave him a look, and Hiccup sighed.
Or I'll try to give you a heads up the next time at least.
Astrid rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. She had changed out of her suit of armor and back into her usual long-sleeved blue tunic and chainmail, tying her belt with her sword and dagger around her waist. The metal shoulder pieces, arm bracers, and false skirt were the only parts of her suit she always wore, along with the greaves on her boots. She walked over to him, making sure to step around the drawings littering the floor. Crossing her arms, she leaned on the wall next to his desk, peering down at what he was working on. Her brows rose a fraction. A lion?
Yeah.
Hiccup shrugged. Suddenly he felt self-conscious.
No inspiration. Thought I'd change things up.
Still no stormfly? Hiccup smiled.
Not this time.
Astrid bumped his arm. Maybe I can trade you a new sketch for a less humiliating excuse for tonight.
How did you...
Hiccup did a take at her. Astrid raised her brow in challenge.
Done and done.
Hiccup chuckled. He paused.
My dad didn't mention Jack today or yesterday. Was that...
Astrid smirked, twirling her dagger. I managed to convince the guards to lose the part about him and Tooth in the report. Hiccup let out a breath of relief.
So you do trust him?
Astrid sighed, shaking her head.
Not quite. I can't say I trust your judgment of him either.
I don't blame you.
Hiccup leaned back, tilting his head at his drawing. Something about the lion's snout was off. He erased some of the rendering to restart.
He doesn't make it easy with that grin of his. It's like we found the twins' long-lost triplet.
Gods, that's what it is.
Astrid pinched the bridge of her nose.
Then what made you put your faith in him?
Good question. Hiccup tapped his pencil against his desk.
He was willing to stick his neck out against the guards, to help me when he barely knew me. So that's got to count for something.
That still didn't explain how fast he had let Jack in. Within 2 days, they went from complete strangers to good enough friends for Hiccup to show him the forge and his project. What really surprised Hiccup was the fact that Jack felt safe enough to be the first person to share a secret about Toothless, albeit not in full detail. Even more surprising, he wasn't regretting it. Maybe it was because, unlike Burkians, Jack didn't seem like he shared a history of the same bloodlust towards dragons. No matter how hard Hiccup had scoured libraries for more information about the dragons themselves, all the books in Berg painted them as mindless monsters. It was why he couldn't even tell Astrid about Toothless. If she knew about him and Hiccup's theory about the outsiders, she would be the first to try and kill him for the safety of the kingdom. So why did he think Jack would be any different? After all, he had read the same stories. It had taken meeting Toothless for Hiccup himself to change his attitude towards dragons at all. He thought back to what Jack had said to him when he promised to help him. It sounded awfully similar to what Hiccup had said about someone else he met recently.
I know what you're feeling, carrying a secret to protect someone else.
I looked at him, and I saw myself.
Hiccup stilled his pencil.
More than that, after talking with him, I get the sense that underneath all the sarcasm and mischief, he genuinely acts out of kindness for others.
Astrid didn't look convinced.
How do you know that's not an act, too?
Hiccup leaned forward, absently working on the lion portrait. He thought back to when he saw Jack playing with the kids in the square, the look he had while making the children laugh. It was the same way he had looked at Hiccup under the wings of his glider. Come to think of it, he had caught a glimpse of it even earlier, during their first conversation sitting in the alley. In the brief time he had known him, Hiccup had seen a wide variety of Jack's smiles. Most of them ranged somewhere from joyful to sarcastic to what seemed to be his favorite, the "I'm about to be a menace to society" elfish grin. But the way he smiled those few times was different. It was genuine and kind. It was a small curve of his lips. It pushed up his cheeks and brought out the subtle freckles on them. It was one that reached all the way to his eyes, crinkling the corners and making the warm hazel even more welcoming. Hiccup wasn't sure if Jack even knew it about himself, but he was starting to recognize it as how Jack smiled when he made others happy. Hiccup lingered on the lion's eyes in the sketch. He wondered if he had any brown-colored charcoal. He met Astrid's eyes.
I have a strong feeling that he's not.
Astrid held his gaze for a long moment, then sighed and sheathed her dagger.
I still have my doubts, but I've got your back.
Hiccup breathed a sigh of relief. He gave her a grateful smile.
Thank you, Astrid.
Astrid smiled back and nodded. She paused.
How do you know his friends aren't spies?
Hiccup couldn't hold back his snort.
The Bards? Are you seriously worried about them?
It could be another cover. After all, Tooth was the one who drew off the entire mob of people alone.
Hiccup leaned back in his chair again, admiring his drawing. He'd unconsciously made the corners of the lion's mouth subtly turn up. He made a note to finish the eyes later.
Well, why don't we check for ourselves?
He raised a brow at Astrid.
How do you feel about going to a show tomorrow?